Chapter 28. Tidus stabbed the blade of his dagger into the dirt beside him. He grabbed fistfuls of his own hair and screamed. He tried to pull at foresight or hindsight, and tried sliding through time, anything. He tried to see the time particles, to just perceive them for a moment. Time still had to be there. It wasn't just gone. But it was out of reach. Tidus bent over his knees, folding in on himself as the emptiness overwhelmed him. They had as good as blinded him. The Omni Tempore might as well have taken his eyes and told him to figure out how to see anyway. Tidus screamed until his voice gave out, and he still shook with the terror, the emptiness, the uncertainty. He had no idea how to break past this block. He had 2 days left, or he would die, and everything would be over. And if he survived those days only to fail, he might as well be dead. Useless, pathetic. Nothing he had ever done would matter, and everything he had ever fought for would evaporate. He would never earn back Kiun's respect. He would never have been worthy in the first place. And Ilaria. She had such faith in him, such faith in everything he did. It would crush her to realize he didn't deserve it. That she had looked up to a failure and a fraud. It would shatter her. Tidus took a shuddering breath and pulled his knife out of the dirt. He couldn't give up. He couldn't surrender. "Yet you persist." Ilaria's words from the day of blood reading wrapped around him. Maybe, he thought desperately, this was the real purpose of the test. A test of faith. A test to see if the Timecasters in training would keep fighting, even with no way to succeed, to persist and remain true. For the Emperor would never forsake those loyal to him. Tidus shakily got to his feet, wiping at the blood dripping down from his neck. He had 2 days. He could figure something out, or he would spend the entire time trying, working, persisting. He could not fail if he didn't give up. That had to be what this all meant. Tidus set his jaw and pushed his way through the foliage, cataloging the plants he passed to keep his mind on track. Staying still wouldn't get him anywhere, even if there was little hope of just stumbling across the singularity without his time sense. It was at least better than sitting around waiting for something to happen. The plants thinned around him, the ground becoming more sandy, until he was no longer splashing through the mud. Grass covered the ground, with jewel-toned frogs appearing as they hopped away at his approach. Tidus caught sight of the tracks of predators, large clawed paw prints, and tried to avoid the hunting areas. Without time sense, it was a deadly guessing game. At least for now, while the sun was out, he had fewer enemies. When night fell, that would change. Tidus chewed his lip, scanning the ground while his mind churned with his time-casting studies. Maybe finding the singularity was the way to get past the block. Maybe he had been going about it backwards. And maybe he was just reaching for a glimmer of hope, because he had already failed. Tidus shook his head, then froze. A set of tracks crossed in front of him, humanoid, and wearing boots. His heart pounded, and the dryness of his mouth became intensely pronounced. No one else should be here. There was no innocent reason for these footprints. One thought burned in Tidus' mind as his heart hammered against his ribs. The assassin was back. And Tidus had none of the skills that had let him fight them off the first time around. Tidus gripped his dagger, crouching low in the grass to conceal himself. The tracks looked fresh. They could be close by. Was this really the assassin? And if it was it the same one? He knew there were others. This could be an entirely new threat. Tidus scanned the area through the marshy reeds and caught sight of someone ahead of him. Familiar in stature. Silvery hair, navy blue skin. and Tidus knew they would have starry freckles dotting their face if they were looking at him. But there was no way Zion was actually here, which meant it was the shape changer. Ice flooded his veins. If they went for the kill this time, they could actually kill him. It would be all over. He couldn't fight them without getting his time-casting back. Tidus let out a slow breath and crept backwards, keeping his breath steady so no gasping would be heard. He needed to put distance between them to figure something out. "There you are," the figure said, turning to stare in his direction with a perfect replica of Zion's face. "I was wondering when you would catch up to me." They strode towards him, and Tidus knew it was time to give up on hiding. It was clearly not working. He straightened to his full stature, wielding the dagger in front of him, his only line of defense. He fixed the assassin with a hard glare. "Don't come any closer," he warned. He knew he probably didn't look all that threatening. Exhausted, lips chapped from dehydration, and bloody runes carved around his neck still scabbing over. But the shape-changer stopped. They tilted their head to the side and looked him over. "Interesting," they said. Then their face rippled and shifted slowly, like it was melting and re-sculpting itself as he watched. It was grotesque, and Tidus wondered fleetingly if it was painful. "Are you here to kill me?" Tidus asked, his palms slick with sweat, making it harder to grip the dagger properly. "You weren't supposed to be here," the shape-changer said, their face settled back into the humanoid one he had seen before. Tidus silently thanked Prometheus they weren't wearing Ilaria's face again. With blue hair in a bob and wide gray eyes. "This is quite the unexpected deviation." "From the future you're so interested in?" Tidus pressed. His heart was fluttering wildly in his chest, and an overdose of adrenaline was threatening to make his entire body tremble, but he held it at bay. The shape-changer wasn't here to kill him, or hadn't come here for that specifically, so he had a chance. And if they were talking, then he had a chance to get information. If he could get information about the terrorists, find out something that would allow them to put a stop to the attacks, maybe that would be enough. Even if he didn't find the singularity, this kind of breakthrough could be valuable enough to prove his worth, at least to buy him more time. The shape-changer nodded, a look of such weariness crossing their features that it made Tidus feel even more exhausted just by being in proximity to it. Tidus blinked hard to shake off the effect. He needed to keep them talking, to get something out of this. He couldn't waste his opportunity. "So, is that your real face?" he asked. "You seem to favor it." The shape-changer flashed a grin at those words. The face they wore looked young, even more so now than when Tidus had first met them, since he himself had grown. "What a question," they said. "I get that a lot, you know. It's just as real as any other face I wear." "What?" Tidus frowned. That wasn't helpful. He wanted a clue to their identity, not a philosophical debate. He needed to guide the conversation. He needed to focus, despite the exhaustion and dehydration writhing inside of him. "Whatever I look like is what I look like," they said with a shrug. "It's just always a funny question to be asked what I really look like. None of my faces are illusions. I just look like what I want to look like. It's not so much something I can do as something I am, you know." Tidus raised an eyebrow, then regretted the expression. He couldn't get drawn in by the shape-changer's ramblings, trying to keep him off topic. He had expected them to be cagier, to guard every scrap of information closely. Instead, despite the information being supremely unhelpful, their tone suggested that they were old friends. It was unsettling. "Who was supposed to be here?" Tidus asked. A shiver ran through him. Helix was also on his third trial right now. Were they looking for him? Would they kill Helix when they found him? Oh, don't panic. I'm not here for the cat. The shape-changer said, like they could read his mind. Tidus clenched his jaw. They knew so much about him, casually throwing out the likeness of his sister's face and knowledge of his singular friendship. What did they want from him? I was going to take care of that Zion brat for you. I'm sure you wouldn't mind. I'll have to try again. Tidus swallowed hard. He was dancing on the sharp edge of a knife with this entire conversation. They could just be lying, or trying to distract him, or maybe they would change their mind and kill him any moment. After all, if there was ever a time to try and kill Tidus, this would be it, when he was at his most vulnerable. And that would be it. Tidus grasped vainly at the memory of timecasting, trying once again to reach the power he knew was there. He knew it still existed, if he could only touch it. Well, I'll get out of your way so you can finish your trial, the shape-changer said, oblivious to his desperation. What do you want from me? Tidus blurted out, anger surging through him. At Time for resisting his call, at the shape-changer for taunting him. Why aren't you trying to kill me? You're working with the Arachne Talam, aren't you? At those words, a furious expression flashed through the shape-changer's eyes. Because he was right, Tidus pressed harder. So you're trying to hurt the Empire, right? Maybe you even want to destroy it. You aren't the Empire, kid. The shape-changer cut him off. Remember that. You're going to have to make some important decisions soon. You need to keep that in mind. You are not the Empire. You can take control of your own fate. Remember what matters to you, and never let it go. The words rang uncomfortably familiar to Tidus, and he furrowed his brow. What does that mean? You think I'm going to help you? He spat. I'm part of the future you have in mind, so you think you can manipulate me into what, treason? You think me telling you to make your own choices and protect what you care about is manipulative, the shape-changer said, voice thick with amusement. Ironic, don't you think? Listen to yourself. You're upset that I don't want you dead? I won't be what you want, Tidus growled, tightening his grip on the dagger. You want me to protect what's important to me? Everything I care about is part of the Empire. Protecting the Empire protects them. People aren't the Empire, the shape-changer said, a trickle of venom making its way into their words. Yes, they are, Tidus said. His mind raced over their words, over everything the shape-changer had said during this trial and the first, how it was meant to mold him, to change him, to use him. They wanted him to become a traitor. Why did they have such confidence that he would? Anger rushed through his veins, and his mind caught on to something they had said only moments ago. Suddenly, he knew why he couldn't reach out and find the power of time, why there was no block when he reached outside of himself for the power. Time casting wasn't something he did, it was something he was, a timecaster. Time was everywhere, including running through him, and the power wasn't something he needed to reach outside for. His anger solidified into white-hot focus. Now he had a chance to take care of the assassin permanently, to not only pass his trial, but eliminate one of the Empire's most dangerous enemies. The kind of victory no one could look down on. What makes you so sure I'll ever be what you want? Tidus demanded. The shape-changer fixed him with a condescending smile, but Tidus turned his focus inward. There it was, a spark, a heat capable of smelting time itself into what he needed, smoldering like a coal that had water poured over it. but the heat was still there. It had never been taken from him, only muffled, deep within him, like the molten core of a planet, and as soon as he found it, it burst back into life. It burned through the binding around his neck and flared with light. The bindings shattered, and time came into sharp focus around him, splintering like smelted glass, windows into hundreds of different realities showering around him. The shape-changer's eyes widened at the shock wave of time-casting that rushed towards them. Tidus couldn't stop it. It was out of his control. It was responding to him on a level that went beyond choice. He blinked, and the shape-changer was gone. Power pulsed through his veins, particles of time visible again, so brilliant they were blinding. The world felt right again, no longer empty and hollow like the past day had been, but instead of settling into something that felt normal, Tidus felt like a spotlight was being shone directly into his eyes. There was too much to see and sense and process. It all blurred together. He reached out for the shape-changer, trying to find their hiding place. But they were nowhere, gone. He pulled up hindsight and watched them talk to him. Then their eyes widened, and they threw up their hands. Their face twisted into an expression of disgust and resignation, and then they were gone. Simply vanished. Tidus groaned and rubbed his eyes, fighting the pounding in his head as the flood of information tried to force its way in. He had lost the shape-changer. Had he killed them? He had no idea, and his restored time-casting was overwhelming his senses. Tidus let out a breath and closed his eyes. He let go of the time sense, letting it settle around him. Instead of trying to understand the details, he let it unfurl into a wide blanket, like back at the cathedral. It helped. The wave of information subsided until a pulsing, undulating presence blinked into his awareness. Almost a day's travel away. It was the temporal singularity. The third trial wasn't over yet. Chapter 29. Tidus fixed his heading on the singularity and forced himself to keep walking. He couldn't afford to waste any time. He barely had time to make it to the singularity before the trial ended as it was. His head pounded, and dehydration plagued his muscles with fatigue. Blood sluggishly oozed down from the cuts around his neck. Tidus stopped when he noticed that. He didn't have to just let it bleed now. He could fix it. He reached up his hand and pulled delicately at the tendrils of time, focusing on the runes that he had carved into his own flesh. That had been a particularly stupid and useless move, as it turned out, only weakening him and not helping even a little bit. He pulled back the time that ran through his skin, knitting it back together and healing it over with a brief flash of pain. Healing that way normally wouldn't leave a scar. He hoped the cuts crossing over the tattoo wouldn't change that. He didn't need evidence of his stupidity literally hanging around his neck forever. Tidus forced his way forward, pushing through increasingly dense foliage and using foresight to pick out the safest path through the forest. Hours passed. His head ached from the constant use of time-casting and the intensity to maintain it. He had hoped it would fade after the initial burst of power, but it seemed to only be growing stronger. Night fell, and the temperature plummeted. Tidus fell to his knees. The terrain had shifted from swamp to sand, branches and vines grabbing at his ankles with every step. He wasn't going to make it like this. He couldn't reach the singularity before it faded, even if he didn't stop for the rest he so desperately needed. The pulsing of the singularity was bright on his mental radar, which he now couldn't seem to turn off, like it was calling to him, begging to be reached. There had to be a way. Tidus rubbed his face with his palms and slapped his cheeks to try and shock himself back to alertness. He was so close. He had broken through the seal. Well, he wasn't sure what he had done to the assassin, but he wasn't dead at least. He couldn't get this far, only to fail. Tidus leaned forward on his hands and knees, breathing heavily. He couldn't get to the singularity in this state. There was only one other option his exhausted mind could come up with. Tidus focused on the presence of the singularity, undulating and pulsing, and reached out towards it. He caught on the time tendrils that swirled around it and pulled. Maybe he could resolve it from a distance. Maybe he had enough range now that he didn't actually need to be within arm's reach of it, or physically touch it. He pulled harder, and the singularity moved, sliding like a bead on a string, getting closer to him. Tidus blinked. Well, that would work too. He kept pulling, reeling in the singularity like a fish, and within minutes a light appeared on the horizon, burning like a bonfire in the dark. The golden light floated towards him, responding to his pull, until it rested within arm's reach. Tidus stood and swayed on his feet. He smiled and reached out his hand, plunging it into the heart of the singularity. His body locked up as something surged through him, something more than just the flow of time he was accustomed to. It started at his fingertips and flowed through his entire body like electricity. His vision went white, spotted with silver, gold, and black pulsing in and out. Tidus tried to scream, to pull his hand out, to do anything, but he was frozen. He reached out to his time casting, pulling frantically at the energy of the singularity to resolve it. His vision came back like he was being sucked through a tunnel, images rushing towards and then past him as fast as he could perceive them. An hourglass snapped in half, a bright light bursting between the halves as the sand spilled out. Faces flashed past him, faces he knew. His family, Helix, other Omni Tempore, and trainees. Some faces morphed and melted into each other like the shape changer. Maybe they were the shape changer. He saw Ilaria when she was young, 5 years old and just learning to read. Then her charred body after the fire. Then an older Ilaria, older than she was even now, and powerful. The older Ilaria gave off an intense aura, her eyes flashing, robes of white and pink billowing around her. A younger Helix flashed through his sight, jumping along stepping stones suspended in space, laughing and carefree. Happy in a way Tidus had never seen him. Then it flashed to Helix, still young, ejected into space and impaled on shrapnel, surrounded by wreckage and bodies. Then the vision shifted again to an older Helix, muscled and vicious, scars interrupting the tattoos on his arms. Tidus saw himself then, as old as the version he saw in the timescape, fighting back to back with Helix, their movements in perfect coordination. The faces sped up, blurring into incomprehensibility, and covered up by a stream of runes and symbols. The broken hourglass repeated over and over, like it was trying to sear itself into Tidus' mind. Tidus had no idea how long he spent in the vision. He gritted his teeth and pulled once again on the time-casting power as hard as he could, and screamed with the effort. The visions came to a sudden halt, giving him a last frozen image of being surrounded by future versions of Ilaria, Helix, himself, the shifting form of the shape-changer, and Kiun, who only faced away from him and never met his gaze. His knees gave out from under him, exhaustion finally digging its claws into him, and the world went black before Tidus hit the ground. Chapter 30. Tidus blinked back to consciousness slowly, but still too quickly for his comfort. Every inch of awareness came with a fresh wave of pain and fatigue. Every muscle in his body was sore, and his head throbbed. His pulse was a sledgehammer against his skull. He groggily processed that there was an IV in his arm, presumably rehydrating him. That seemed important. Tidus tried to push himself up into a sitting position, but heavy restraints around his wrists and across his chest held him down. Tidus forced his eyes open and scanned the room. June leaned against the wall next to the door, staring at him. They were on the Epoch's echo. Tidus swallowed hard, his throat like sandpaper. "Why am I?" he rasped, tugging at one of the wrist restraints. June's gaze bored into him. Then he crossed the room and reached for the buckles on the restraints. "Had to make sure you would be in control of yourself when you woke up," June said. His tone was laced with something Tidus couldn't identify. "Did you carve that conduit circle into your skin with your dagger?" Tidus frowned, reaching up with his now free hand to touch the skin of his collarbone. It still tingled faintly. It must have scarred. Now his lapse in judgment would be visible to anyone with enough knowledge to see it for what it was. "It seemed like a good idea," he said lamely. "I mean, it didn't work, but—" "Didn't work?" June asked. "What makes you say that?" Tidus blinked. "It didn't break the binding." "Well, maybe not." June finished releasing Tidus from the restraints and stepped back. "But it's sure working now. This, well, it's only been accomplished 6 times before. 3 of the Timecasters who did it died from the strain of the power. 2 others lost their minds." Tidus swallowed. That explained the restraints. He had almost killed himself or turned his mind into soup with his conduit circle. The pulse of time still pressed against his mind, like his head was a balloon being overinflated. Everything had been more intense since he'd broken through the seal. The flow of power, both input and output, was overwhelming. "That explains the headache," Tidus said weakly. June laughed. "You're one to watch out for, that's for sure." He arranged his face into a more serious expression. "Well, you should be fine, health-wise anyway, by the time we return to Dothara. You've passed your 3rd trial, which means you are entering the final stages of Omni Tempore training." Tidus nodded, curling his fingers into fists. If he thought the training so far had been hard, it would be nothing compared to what he still had to face. This was no time to celebrate. He still had plenty of time to fail, to prove himself a complete waste of blood, if he allowed himself to grow complacent. He hoped Helix had passed his trial. "To be a member of the Omni Tempore isn't merely an occupation," June said, fixing Tidus with a hard stare. "To serve the Emperor on the highest level, the way we must, requires complete dedication, unwavering loyalty, no distractions. When we return to Dothara, I will deliver you to the Antirrhinum estate, so you can make your final goodbyes." "Final goodbyes?" Tidus echoed. "What do you mean?" "Complete dedication, no distractions," June repeated. "Your family will be protected by the grace of the Emperor and by the service you provide. We cannot afford to be distracted or dragged down by outside connections. As it says in the treatise of Caliban Voidforged, honor your gifts and treasure your sacrifices. You will have 2 days before you are returned to the cathedral." "And then I can't see them anymore?" Tidus asked, his entire body reeling. This couldn't be happening. Treasure your sacrifices was never supposed to mean his family. He would sacrifice his own life first, but that's not what was being asked. Timecasters have no contact with their families after the 3rd trial, except for the farewells," June said. His tone left no room for argument. Tidus swallowed hard.
If you desire to fulfill your purpose and serve the Emperor, then you will be willing to make this sacrifice and dedicate yourself entirely to the Omni Tempore. Consequences for treachery are severe. Anyone found in breach of this, engaging in unauthorized familiarization, will be discovered, and those tainted by such a breach will be eliminated.
Tidus' eyes widened as the words sank in. If I talk to my family after this, you'll kill them. It wasn't a question. Eliminated could only mean one thing.
No, June said. We won't kill them. You will.
Tidus snapped his mouth shut to keep any sound from escaping, even though he wanted to scream. The room around him felt so much colder all of a sudden. He wanted to deny it, to refuse to believe it. He would never kill his family. He couldn't. They couldn't make him. Except he knew that was a lie. They could make him. Dominating someone's will took a lot of power, and even more skill. Not just anyone could do it. Any member of the Veritas Ruptore could do it, and the Praetorian Guard were said to have that power. There was a reason traitors weren't just puppeted by the more powerful into following orders. It wasn't sustainable in the long term, but that didn't make it any less of a valid threat for something like this. Tidus knew the Omni Tempore made no idle threats. A roiling mess of despair, shock, and fear threatened to explode out of Tidus. He fought it down, clinging to the words that June had uttered and that Tidus had clung to for years. Treasure your sacrifices. He had used those words to fight against the pain of death for so long. Now they were supposed to guide him in sacrificing his family, the one thing he had fought for since the beginning. How could he do this without them? Without ever receiving another letter from Ilaria, without making things right with Kiun, without the choice to ever prove himself to his father. But he had no choice. If he didn't abide by this, they would be killed. He would be forced to kill them with his own hands. As horrible as cutting them off would be, killing them would be worse. And this was the will of the Emperor. It was to protect them, even if Tidus didn't understand it. His will was always for the good of the Empire and its citizens. Treasure your sacrifices, even when those sacrifices hurt worse than death. Tidus swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. I understand, he said.
Good,
June replied. Turning to leave the room, a med drone detached from the wall and landed on Tidus' arm like a massive beetle with a rotating head equipped with a series of medical tools. A sterile, rubbery proboscis reached out and removed the IV, placing a bandage over the needle site. Tidus flexed his arm and rolled his shoulder. There was definitely more than water and electrolytes in the IV bag. The exhaustion had fled from his muscles and bones, and he felt like he had gotten several decent nights' sleep, though the clock indicated it had only been a matter of hours. Even with the physical rejuvenation, what he had to do next weighed heavily on his soul. He had to make his final goodbyes to his family. No wonder Lynn had looked so distant and detached after she had returned from her third trial. Tidus wished Helix could come with him, to lean on and support him. Then he realized that if Helix had survived the third trial, he had no goodbyes to say. His family was already gone. A slimy, thick tendril of jealousy slid into Tidus' gut at the thought. Helix didn't have to make any sacrifices after completing his third trial. It was just another trial to him, but not to Tidus. By the time they reached Dothara, Tidus had changed into fresh clothes and attempted to make himself look presentable. Catching his reflection, he could see the scars the conduit circle had left, glinting gold like spider silks on the tattoo they overlapped. He adjusted his tunic so it covered most of the marks and hoped his family wouldn't notice enough to distinguish the scars from the tattoos. He didn't want to explain that, as part of the last time he was allowed to see them. The shuttle of the Epoch's Echo delivered him to the same platform where Muse had first collected him. How long ago now? Tidus did the math and counted it up. Just shy of 2 years for him. 6 months less than that for his family. He stepped off the shuttle, and Ilaria caught him in a hug. "It's good to see you again," he said, squeezing tightly. Ilaria was taller than he remembered, and hadn't that only been a few months ago? "Your eyes are all the way golden now," Ilaria said, pulling back to look at him. "Did you know? They've been changing ever since you went away." "Oh?" Tidus asked. "I guess I didn't notice." All the Omni Tempore he had seen had golden eyes. Even the other recruits always seemed to have gold mixed in with the natural color of their eyes. He hadn't spent much time staring at his own. "I like it," Ilaria declared with a bright smile. "Oh, did you hear? I've been offered a position to study with the divinators in Reklum." Tidus' eyes widened, and he looked to his parents. They smiled proudly and nodded. "That's amazing, Ilaria," he said. "How soon?" "I have to wait until I turn 12, she said, pouting like she was 7 years old again. Tidus smiled. "That's not too far off. Don't worry." He put an arm around her shoulders and guided her towards their parents. His heart grew heavier with every step. He had to tell them. They needed to know this would be the last time they would see him. He swallowed hard. "Is Kyun here?" "He's on his way," his father said. There was tension behind his words that skewered Tidus' heart. He bit back the worry and nodded. He would wait at least until everyone was present. He didn't want to have to say goodbye more than once. "I just can't believe how fast you've grown up, Tidus," his mother said, her eyes starry with tears. Tidus smiled and pulled his mother into a hug. He was taller than her now and at eye level with his father. He wouldn't be able to measure himself against them any more after this, so he memorized every moment of it. The feeling of his mother's hug, the smell of her perfume, the smile on his father's face, and the ruby-red shine of his eyes. His own eyes used to look like that. All of his childhood he had been told how much he looked like his father. Now his eyes were the bright gold of the Omni Tempore. How much more would he change by the end of this? Would he even be recognizable as an Antirrhinum? Was he already unrecognizable? "I could say the same thing about Ilaria," Tidus said, shooting his sister a smile. She returned it proudly. "Before I left, you'd never have convinced me she would take anything seriously enough to become a divinator." Ilaria scrunched up her nose at that and stuck out her tongue, earning a laugh from both of their parents. Tidus pursed his lips against a fresh wave of anguish that the laughter brought with it. He couldn't ruin this moment. This was it. Once he told them he would be leaving, this joy would be shattered, and he could never get it back. He managed to keep them talking, asking about Ilaria's divinator training, and sharing a few anecdotes of his own until Kyun's shuttle came into view over the horizon. They all watched it dock, and Tidus steeled himself for what was coming. His brother disembarked and approached them with a forced smile. A claw reached its way into Tidus' chest and scraped along his heart. If Kyun had looked tired and unwell before, now he looked positively gaunt. The shadows under his eyes had darkened. "This is a surprise," Kyun said, walking over to Tidus. Tidus grabbed him in a tight hug and closed his eyes. He could feel Kiun's bones under the embrace. His clothes concealed it, but he had lost weight. Too much.
"Oh, you okay?"
Tidus pulled back and realized as he opened his eyes that tears had finally made their appearance in his eyes, wetting his cheeks. He hated this. He had to tell them that he was leaving forever. And this was not how he wanted to remember Kiun. "I'm all right," Tidus said. "I just have something to tell you all."
"What is it?"
Kiun asked, furrowing his brow. Everyone was silent, waiting for Tidus to speak, except his mother, who was still looking at Kiun, her lips puckered with displeasure. Tidus searched for the right words. Where was he supposed to start? Well, it's about why I'm visiting," Tidus explained, carefully avoiding letting a nervous stammer creep into his words. "I just completed the 3rd out of 5 trials, so I'm going into the second half of my training, where it gets really serious, I guess." "Sounded pretty serious all along to me," Ilaria said, frowning. Tidus smiled slightly at that. She wasn't wrong. "It's just, now that I'm so close to the end, so far along," Tidus continued, trying to remember how June had worded it. It had made a horrible kind of sense then, even if he didn't like it. He had understood it. He needed his family to understand. "I have to put my focus completely on my training, my work. I have to make sure there's nothing distracting me or holding me back." Ilaria reached out and grabbed his hand, her expression intense, but not confused. She could feel what was coming. "This is—" Tidus tried, but the words died in his throat, and he took a moment to compose himself. "After this, I won't be able to see you again, or contact you at all. I have to be fully dedicated, you know." He trailed off and watched the information wash over his family. Ilaria's face twisted in anguish, and tears welled up in her eyes. Kiun's eyes widened, and he grabbed Tidus by the shoulders, gripping him tightly with his bony fingers, like he wasn't sure this was the real Tidus who had said such a thing. His grasp was desperate, like the fact that Tidus was leaving him made him suddenly worth holding on to. His parents. Tidus blinked. Had they heard what he'd said? His mother and father just stood there, expressions as proud as before. Not shocked, not a hint of sorrow. They were all proud smiles. Maybe they were trying to put on a brave face for their children. "But when you're done with your training," Ilaria said, her voice quavering, "once you've done all your training, and then you can come back home, right? Then I can see you again?" "No, Ilaria," Tidus replied softly. Her words pushed the claw deeper into his heart. "I have to. I can't. It's safer this way." Ilaria threw herself into his arms, burying her face in his shirt, tears soaking through. "What am I supposed to do without you?" she cried. It brought back painfully the memory of when she had cried like this before, when Tidus had failed to save Kiun. Her most anguished tears had always been because of him. Tidus met his brother's eyes. Kiun stood, having let his hands drop to his sides, his face ashen and expression vacant, hollow. "You're going to be just fine," Tidus reassured her, trying to convince himself as much as his sister. "You know, I'll always be out there, helping keep the Empire safe, yeah? And you'll have the divinators, and Mom and Dad, and Kiun." Ilaria cried harder, and Tidus looked to his parents for help. His mother stepped forward and gently pried Ilaria off of Tidus. "Oh, honey, there's no need for such hysterics," she said. "This is a wonderful blessing that Tidus has been granted. Most of us never have the chance to offer such a gift to the Emperor."
"It is the highest honor anyone could hope for," his father agreed, joining in the effort to pull Ilaria out of her tears. "You should be proud to have such a brother."
"I am proud," Ilaria snarled, "but that doesn't mean I'm happy about never seeing him again." Her cries pained Tidus, but not as much as his parents' expressions had begun to sting. He didn't want his parents to be upset. Not really, not in theory. But he saw the way his mother sighed, as if Ilaria was being silly, as if this wasn't something that should be affecting them so much, as if this was inevitable, like it was what his parents had always hoped for. That the only way they could be proud of him, the only way he could have ever proven himself, was by leaving them behind entirely. That was what they wanted. The only way to secure a place in their hearts was to give up his place in their home. "We're so happy for you, Tidus," the Baroness said. The way she said it, the look in her eyes, all of it made Tidus want to take a step back. It felt sickly and wrong, empty. He had worked so hard for so long, always holding out hope that if he worked hard enough, he wouldn't disappoint his parents, wouldn't lose them. But now the truth was on display. Nothing he could ever have done would have prevented this. He wasn't losing his parents by leaving them behind. Somehow, without noticing, he had lost them long ago, or maybe he had never really had them in the first place. Chapter 31. 2 days wasn't nearly enough time for Tidus, at least not for what he wanted to say to Ilaria and Kiun, although it seemed to be all too much time when it came to his parents. Ilaria had stopped crying eventually, but the distant expression that replaced her tears was almost worse. Tidus had convinced Kiun to go to the glass dunes with him again, but they sat in silence, staring at the stars instead of talking. Kiun had little to say to him, and Tidus couldn't find the words when he looked at his brother. He tried to ask him what was wrong, why he looked so run down and borderline sickly, but Kiun refused to even acknowledge his questions, just wished him luck on his training, congratulated him with that hollow voice that Tidus hated. He hated that this was how he had to leave Kiun, that after this he could only hope his brother would be okay, and he still had no idea what was really wrong. Ilaria snuck into his room with her silver-accented dragon, Arianwen, and both of them had fallen asleep waiting for him to return from the glass dunes. Quiet as he was, Ilaria opened her eyes as soon as he entered the room. He sat down next to her, both of them leaning against Arianwen's scaly flank, and let her braid a gold ribbon into his hair, just behind his left ear. "That way you can keep me with you," she whispered. Tidus smiled, but it felt broken even to him. At least he wouldn't have to worry as much about Ilaria being in danger. She would be a divinator, studying in Reklum itself. She would be about as safe as it got, and divinators were never sent on dangerous jobs. They had no risky duties to perform. They were more like savants. Divinators spent their days in study and prayer, connecting to the will of the Emperor and channeling his divinity into blessings for his subjects. They were healers, curse breakers, and seers. They were not warriors. Tidus was glad of that. He wondered if she would dye her hair pink, the fashion of divinator initiates and the nobility in Reklum at large. Maybe it would match her eyes. The one thing the 2 days did give him was time to adjust to the volume of his timecasting. The conduit circle around his neck had done its job, and everything had been dialed up in intensity. He no longer had to expend any effort to send his time sense out and gather information about the world around him. Faint mirages of foresight and echoes of hindsight over a few seconds were always visible in the trails of time particles. Once he had adjusted to the new level of power, it was like the world had been thrown into high definition. Everything was clearer and sharper than it had ever been, instead of the grainy quality of looking through a sandstorm that he had usually seen with his timecasting. Now he could see every detail. When the shuttle returned him to the cathedral, everything felt different, yet painfully the same. His steps were mechanical and stiff as he tread the familiar path to his room. He was so enveloped in his thoughts, in trying to align his heart with what he had to do, that he didn't notice Helix coming until the Oletheron wrapped an arm around his shoulders and nearly threw him entirely off balance. "Welcome back," Helix said, giving him a side hug and curling his tail around Tidus' ankle. "Man, the third trial was really something, huh? You look like you need a good nap to recover from it." Helix chattered like nothing was different, like it was any other trial. Tidus was painfully reminded that for Helix nothing was different at all. For him this was just like any other trial. Tidus pulled away from the embrace. "I'm fine," he said. "Glad to see you made it." "You doubted me. Rude," Helix said with a laugh. "Hey, whoa, what is up with your tattoo?" Helix eyed Tidus' collar, and then reached forward to pull the tunic down and give himself a clearer view. His eyes widened at the sight of the scars, and his ears flattened against his head. "What in the eternal nightmare did you do?" Helix whispered, horror lacing his words. His tail tightened its hold on Tidus' ankle. Tidus glared at him and pulled his tunic back into place. "I was trying to break through the seal, obviously," he snapped. "It didn't work then, but, well, it's working now." "You added a conduit circle to your mark?" Helix asked, his voice so low no one else would hear it, and dripping with amazement. "That is genius. I can't believe I didn't think of that. I spent so long meditating I wanted to bash my head in with a rock." His friend's words slid over him like oil on water. They felt hollow, meaningless. Tidus didn't have the energy to pretend nothing had changed. And Helix couldn't understand. "Look, Helix, I think I want to be alone right now," Tidus said. He turned away, shoulders hunched. "Oh, sorry." Helix's ears flicked back again. "Well, when you don't want to be alone anymore, just let me know. You know how to find me." Helix moved like he was going to put a hand on Tidus' shoulder, or hug him or something, but thought better of it, and disappeared around the corner. His departure left a chill over Tidus, a shadow of where the embrace would have been, if Tidus could stand it. He went to his room and collapsed on the bed. He rubbed the marks around his neck, the conduit circle still constantly flooding his mind with information, his body buzzing with energy like electricity. It hummed on his skin. He had gotten more than he had bargained for with the third trial in every way possible. And now he couldn't even hold a conversation with Helix without feeling like he was eating broken glass. Tidus ended up avoiding Helix to stay away from that feeling. He didn't look at him during class and hid out in his room to avoid the common areas during meal and study hours. He could avoid it no longer when he stepped into the sparring ring in the afternoon, and Helix stood opposite him. Tidus bit his lip. Helix gave him a hesitant smile, and Tidus couldn't find it in himself to return it. "Let's see if you can finally beat me," Helix said, raising his eyebrows. "With that fancy power-up you gave yourself. How about it?" "I guess we'll find out." Tidus forced the words out around his teeth. He slid into a fighting stance, and Helix did the same, crouching low to the ground with his tail lashing in anticipation. Tidus focused on the time particles, bringing up foresight just as the instructor signaled for the fight to start. Helix leapt forward, pulling on his own time casting. Tidus could feel the shift in the air. The particles around Helix sharpened, like they were smelted into glass, and the image of Helix fractured, 100 possible timelines visible for that brief second. Tidus pushed more of his energy into foresight, and the sliver of reality that Helix was reaching for lit up. Tidus grabbed onto it, snatching it away, out of Helix's reach, and the images shattered around Helix, dissolving back into sand, and a shockwave went out from both of them. Helix's eyes widened. "Now that's a neat trick," he breathed. "You couldn't do that before." Tidus scowled. Every word from Helix stung like rubbing dirt into an open wound. He was trying to start up banter, just like yesterday, acting like nothing had changed, like things were the same, like it didn't matter. "Are you still treating this all like a game?" Tidus growled, hitting Helix in the chest with the flat of his hand. Helix slid backwards across the floor. "It's more fun that way, don't you think?" Helix said, his grin widening. He leaned forward, ears perked up, and tail flicking playfully behind him. Anger burned in Tidus' gut. Helix could treat it like a game because he had never had anything to prove or anyone to prove it to. He didn't have to take it seriously because it didn't matter to him, not the way it mattered to Tidus. "You really think you can get through training like that? Become an Omni Tempore?" Tidus knew his voice was rising towards a shout. He didn't care. "When you don't even take this seriously!" Helix frowned at that, circling Tidus instead of lunging for another attack. "What's going on?" he asked, dodging Tidus' next two attacks without returning them. "What are you so mad about?" "You're treating this all like a joke," Tidus yelled. He grabbed at the time particles flowing through Helix and yanked the other boy back through time, back within Tidus' reach. "Whoa! I know it's not a joke," Helix said, barely dodging Tidus' next blow by ensnaring his arm in a brief time loop. Tidus broke through it just as Helix ducked once again. "What's the matter with you?" Rage flared through Tidus, and he reached out with both hands, pulling at the time around them until it stopped inside the arena, freezing Helix in place. "What's wrong with me?" he demanded. "I can't believe you. You know, some of us are making actual sacrifices. Some of us have actual consequences to live with. I don't just get to coast along, waiting to see what happens next." He grabbed Helix and slammed him to the ground, shrinking the time freeze until it only encased the other. Helix pulled at the time freeze, loosening it in Tidus' grasp until it fell away, but he was still pinned beneath Tidus. His face flashed through 100 different emotions until it settled on cold. "Fine," he said, rasping around Tidus' arm, pressing on his throat. "You win." Tidus stood, clenching his fists at his sides, then turned on his heel and left the arena. Tears burned at the edges of his vision, and a sob clawed at the inside of his throat. Helix didn't follow him. His tail curled around his own ankle. Chapter 32. "Good morning, Tidus." Timothy's voice jolted Tidus out of a restless sleep. "Your schedule for today has been altered. Instead of your lecture hall class, you will be reporting to the North Wing entrance." "Thanks, Tim." Tidus sighed, pushing himself out of bed. Exhaustion clung to him ever since his fight with Helix 2 weeks before. No amount of sleep had managed to banish it. "It's Timothy," Timothy corrected. Tidus rolled his eyes. "Also, since you requested updates on your family, I recommend you check your comm screen as soon as you are fully awake." "Oh, great, thanks," Tidus said. He swiped his sleeve over his eyes and stretched. Ilaria's initiation into the divinators was coming up, and he wanted to catch the footage. It pained him that he couldn't be there to congratulate her personally, but seeing her happy would be enough, even from a distance. At least, he told himself it would be enough. Tidus opened his comm screen and tapped the blinking update icon. Instead of camera footage and the icon of the divinatum, a severe news headline filled the screen. Gilded Antirrhinum found dead. Tidus held his thumb over the power button, watched the screen fade to black, then flung it across the room, his mind blanking out. He gasped for breath, staring at the fallen comm screen. He had misread it. That had to be it. His body went numb from the soles of his feet up, and he picked up the screen. He would open it and see what it really said. Everything would be fine. Tidus blinked hard twice, then powered up his comm screen again. The headline glared up at him in harsh, unfeeling black and white. Tidus collapsed to his knees, a white-knuckled grip around the edge of his comm screen as he stared at it, begging the words to change, pleading for it to not be true. But the words didn't change. They just kept scrolling across the screen, spelling out a reality Tidus had been sure he had avoided. Hadn't he died twice, just to make sure this wouldn't happen? How could this be happening now? Tidus took a shuddering breath and forced his eyes to focus. He needed to know what had happened. The heir to the Antirrhinum barony was found dead at 7:43 this morning in his chambers at the Dawn Luster Academy, after he was uncharacteristically late for the monthly coordination meeting. He was found alone, and while the cause of death was not initially clear, it has been reported a lethal amount of larixene was found in his blood, a drug used medically to cause paralysis. In lethal doses, it is known to cause the heart to stop. At this time, it is unclear if Gilded Antirrhinum was the victim of foul play, but the Empire's finest are investigating now and will not rest until the matter is settled. Even the air in Tidus' lungs seemed frozen, choking him as he tried to breathe. He closed the official public report and opened the secure reports center. He had limited access to it before training under the Omni Tempore. Now his fingerprint and retina scan opened the entire database. There had to be a mistake. It was a cover-up. Maybe Gilded had been kidnapped, and they didn't want that made public. Then Gilded could still be saved. Tidus scanned through the files and reports and opened the one from that morning labeled Gilded Antirrhinum. He skimmed over the lines of the report, and ice filled his stomach, freezing its way up his throat. There was no suspected foul play. That was just a story the Empire wanted to put in the public mind. Gilded hadn't been poisoned by the Arachne Talam or any other malcontents. He had killed himself. A file attached blinked ominously from the corner of the report. Tidus stared at it, sick to his stomach, as he read the label. Gilded had left a note. He didn't want to know, but he had to. He couldn't move on without knowing what Gilded had said, why he had done this, why he was gone. Tidus opened the note and held his breath. Mother, father, and Ilaria. The absence of his own name hit Tidus like a punch to the gut, but he realized Gilded wouldn't have expected him to read it. Maybe he didn't expect Tidus to even know he had died. I'm so sorry to do this to you all. I know it will cause you much pain. I wish there was another way. I wish more than anything that I could spare you all this, but I can't. This has been a long time coming, and I no longer have any excuses. I'm sorry to leave you all with questions, but the truth of this is not mine to share. I just want you to know that I love you so much. Ilaria, you are going to be such a wonderful divinator. The Empire is truly lucky to have you. You have always had a talent for seeing the truth of things, so I trust you will see the truth of this as well. Do not spend too many tears on me. Mother, you taught me the meaning of faith. I have always treasured the time we spent in the garden and how you cared for every living thing that made up our world. Thank you for that. It is because of you that I can find peace in this. Father, please do not be disappointed. I only hope you can trust me when I say that this needed to be. To run from this would be to turn my back on everything you ever taught me. I know it will make things harder for you, and I'm sorry for that. Most of all, please believe that this was not cowardice. This is not a surrender. This is something I have known I must do for some time, but finally worked up the courage to go through with. I will find peace in the light of the Emperor, and I know someday you will all join me. And I hope then there will be no secrets between us. Ever faithful, your son and brother, Kiyun. The entire world around Tidus froze. He dropped the comm screen and let it clatter face down. The words of the note swirled through his head like the winds of a hurricane, and the truth wrapped around him like chains. His brother was dead, and it was his fault. He had failed his brother more completely than he had realized. Tidus had thought he needed to prove himself to Kiyun, that he needed to prove he was worth having alive. He had been blind. Kiyun had wasted away, crushed under a guilt that Tidus was too self-centered to address, too foolish to even imagine. Kiyun didn't think he was supposed to be alive, because of what Tidus had to do to save him. If Tidus had just kept him from knowing, if he had just gotten it right, his brother would still be alive. And what about Ilaria? She had been the one to let it slip first. How would this feel to her? Had Kiyun even thought of her?
Tidus.
Helix's voice burst into his mind.
Hey, what's going on? Are you okay?
Get out of my head, Tidus snapped.
Love to, but you're kind of putting a time freeze over the entire dorm,
Helix responded. Tidus grimaced and pulled back on his timecasting. It leaked out so easily now, triggered at his slightest thought. He hadn't realized that he had been holding time in place.
Thanks,
Helix's voice came through, relieved but still tinged with concern.
So, wanna talk about it? Obviously, something is up.
Tidus swallowed and turned his gaze skyward, trying to stem the flow of tears pouring from his eyes. His entire body ached, and he wanted nothing more than to dissolve into a sobbing mess, to curl up in his blanket and spend the day crying. But he could not be afforded that luxury. He was expected to be present at the North Wing entrance in 2 hours, and cutting off communication with his family was to facilitate his total focus on training, to eliminate distraction. Even keeping tabs on them the way he did was only allowed if they didn't think it was holding him back. He couldn't give them a reason to take this away. There would be no allowances made for this.
My brother is dead.
Tidus let the thought make its way to Helix, biting down on his knuckles to try and pull himself together. He had to make himself presentable. On the day of his brother's death. It was like some cruel, twisted joke the universe was playing on him.
What happened?
Helix finally asked.
He killed himself, and it's my fault.
What?
I'm sure it's not your fault, Tidus. Don't blame yourself. You don't know anything. I know you're a good person, and whatever happened,
Whatever he blamed you for. He blamed me for saving him. He thought he should have died that day. Then he's an idiot for not being grateful to you. Get out of my head." Tidus cut the connection and screamed, not even muffling the sound in a pillow. He screamed until his lungs hurt and the sound echoed through the halls. Kiun was dead and completely out of reach, dead by his own hand, and he had waited until Tidus would no longer be able to save him. Maybe that was why he had finally done it. Maybe he had wanted to end himself this entire time. How desperately had he hated his life for the past 2 years? And Tidus had been so selfish that he thought it was all about himself. Kiun had died because Tidus had made the fatal mistake of letting him see the truth. This, more than anything else, must be why they had to cut off all communication with their families. Being a Timecaster was no easy task. It was complicated and painful. The only way to protect the people they loved, to keep the general public safe, was to make sure they only ever saw a carefully curated lie. Chapter 33. Tidus stood at the threshold of the North Wing feeling empty and dry, like a wrung-out sponge. The North Wing had been totally inaccessible to them before today, and he could feel the anticipation coming off of Dasha. Zion, as always, acted unimpressed. And Helix kept trying to catch Tidus' eye, even as Tidus kept his gaze fixed firmly forward, and his lips pressed together. He couldn't speak to anyone right now, and if he made eye contact with Helix, he was sure he would only start crying again. Ugly, body-racking sobs. He couldn't afford that kind of weakness, especially not in front of Magina Perrin. The second highest-ranked Omni Tempore stood in front of them, scanning them with her harsh, golden-eyed gaze. "I'm honestly surprised all 4 of you have made it this far," she said. "But it saves me some time to have you all in a batch like this. The north wing of the cathedral is beyond this threshold, a place you will now be permitted to enter. It also contains the site of your 4th trial." A silent tension swept through the others, and Tidus tried to convince himself that it mattered. Tried to force himself to care. It was important, he knew that, but instead of feeling it as an urgency, now it was like he watched the whole thing from a distance, like he was an audience to his own life. "Your 4th trial pertains to one of the Omni Tempore's great responsibilities," Magina continued. "In addition to training new recruits and quelling the rebellion of new planets, the Omni Tempore protect the Empire from a truly sinister threat. Creatures of the void are not just children's tales, though that is how our citizens can view them thanks to our work. When a rift opens, creatures of the void attempt to invade our empire. It is our job to destroy those that come through and keep them where they belong." Tidus clasped his hands behind his back and nodded. He had found references to creatures of the void in his research before. He had suspected they would come into the training at some point. "The most formidable of the creatures you will face is a void shifter," Magina said. "They are like a dark reflection of a Timecaster. That is, they are able to use abilities very similar to our own. Additionally, they are one of the 2 things that can permanently kill a Timecaster." Tidus sucked in a breath at that. He had grown used to the idea that the golden daggers everyone at the cathedral carried could kill him. It was unnerving, sure, but he knew how to handle the other Timecasters, to a point. He had been too comfortable in his assumption that there was nothing else out there he needed to fear. Your fourth trial will be to face one of these void shifters in combat, Magina said. We capture juveniles and bring them here for just such occasions. Your formal, structured classes end today. You will no longer be given a schedule or prescribed study material. We will no longer hold your hands. You may attend lectures, you may study as you will, and you may request specific instructional time with instructors as you desire. When you are called to your fourth trial, if you have prepared, you may survive. Are there any questions? The silence that filled the air was so chilling that Tidus was surprised he couldn't see his own breath. He knew none of them wanted to ask a question of Magina any more than he did, and he wanted that like he wanted to be shot in the head. Magina was terrifying. Her presence contained so much raw power. She could obliterate any of them if she really wanted to. He would much rather keep his head down and get out of the situation as quickly as possible. But Tidus had fought too hard, had given up too much, to let himself become middle of the pack now. Honor your gifts and treasure your sacrifices. All of his sacrifices had led him here. Tidus steeled himself and spoke. For the specific training you mentioned, he started, forcing himself to maintain eye contact when Magina's gaze snapped to his. It was easier than he'd expected, like her gaze didn't quite pierce the cloud that surrounded him. Are we able to request you, ma'am? A smile spread over Magina's face, dangerous and deadly. Of course, she said. Just remember, I don't go easy. Not on anyone. You can't kill us, though. Not during training, can you? It was Helix's voice this time, laced with concern. Tidus glanced at him but looked away quickly, as his lungs constricted dangerously. Not permanently, Magina said. Now, are there any other questions? No other questions were forthcoming, so Magina dismissed them with a wave of her hand and swept past them. Zion left in the direction of the library. Helix hovered near the hall Tidus had emerged from, still watching him. Tidus had kept up enough of a barrier that Helix hadn't been able to speak in his mind yet. He drew a shaky breath. He wasn't ready to talk to him. Instead, Tidus studiously avoided looking in Helix's direction and walked into the north wing. The architecture shifted drastically as soon as he stepped over the threshold. The warm tones of the marble and oak vanished. Instead, stones were darker, like they had mined obsidian from a volcanic field, and tapestries lined the walls. They depicted, well, something. Unlike the iconography in the entry hall, these were unfamiliar. Dark purples, blues, and blacks made up the base of the depictions, occasionally brightened with a figure laced with bright gold. The figures had time-casting mandalas encircling them, clearly the Omni Tempore. The rest, Tidus realized as he scanned over it, must be creatures of the void. They had too many teeth, eyes, and arms. In some of the tapestries, the creatures loomed over bloody battlefields, feasting on corpses, maws dripping with blood. In others, they emerged from swirling vortexes, void rifts. Now that's what I call art. Dash's voice startled Tidus out of his thoughts. He glanced over at her warily. How had he not seen her coming? Had she learned Morad's skill of concealing herself from time sense? Chill out, she said, waving her hand. I heard you broke up with Helix. That true? Tidus looked back towards the tapestry, clasping his hands behind his back. His heart squeezed at the question, tight and cold. Had he broken up with Helix? He couldn't bring himself to look at his friend, much less speak with him. And that was before, when his family had still been alive. Before he had killed his brother. It wasn't sustainable. Tidus said simply, "Fair enough." Dasha shrugged. "I always thought whatever you two had going was a little weird, if you ask me." "I just didn't want to be alone," Tidus said. He shouldn't keep talking. He definitely shouldn't tell Dasha any personal information she could potentially use against him. But even his own cautionary thoughts rang hollow. Did it really matter? "I didn't get it before, but there's no place for distracting friendships among the Omni Tempore." Distraction. Weakness. "You can say that again." Dasha swished her tail behind her. "That kitty never really got it. I figured that out on day one. He's not like us." That was the real problem in the end. Helix didn't get it. He had been here too long, didn't have enough of a life outside of the cathedral to ever be able to understand. He couldn't talk to Helix about it because it was like speaking in a language Helix didn't know and could never learn. Tidus glanced at Dasha, and the new golden tattoo around her neck, the faint lilac scar along her lip. "How'd your family take it?" Tidus asked. He half expected Dasha to refuse to answer or to brush it off. Instead, she looked towards the tapestry, her once jade eyes now solid, glittering gold, and sighed. "My mom, I'm not sure she'll remember where I went after she gets done drinking her feelings." Dasha scowled and clenched a fist. "But hey, maybe she'll get lucky and drink enough not to remember me at all." Tidus could feel her anger, her bitter hurt, coming off her in waves. It was familiar. Their situations were shades different, but the feelings were the same. "My sister cried for almost the whole 2 days," Tidus said softly. "My parents were just proud." "Yikes," Dasha said. Tidus let out a dry chuckle. He didn't mention Kiyun. He wasn't ready to talk to anyone about that. And that wasn't something anyone else was likely to understand. It was a nightmare of his own making, unique in its anguish. "Yeah, that pretty much sums it up," he concluded. "Well, have fun during this Hall of Horrors," Dasha shrugged. "And if you start to get heartsick for your cat, just remember." She turned and started walking away as she spoke, her violet tail reaching up along Tidus' spine and across his hip, sending a tingling ripple through his body. "There are other ways to get over being lonely." Tidus didn't look at her as she left, clenching his fists to keep himself in check. Not talking to Helix was almost as bad as the few words they had exchanged since the third trial. It was almost as painful as leaving his family had been in the first place, which was ridiculous because Helix wasn't even family. He shouldn't matter like this, and he certainly had no right to speak about Kiyun.
"Oh, look who it is."
Zion's voice came from around the corner, and Tidus rolled his eyes, desperately trying to reel in his gaping despair and compose himself. Of all people, he had no idea how Zion had stayed sane. He couldn't imagine them ever having a friend or confidant, not to mention family back home.
"I bet you think you're something special, huh? Heard about the conduit you carved into your skin. Could have killed you, you know."
"Almost did," Tidus said, forcing a stiff shrug. "I'm sure that's what you would have preferred."
"Naturally," Zion agreed. "Don't think I'm intimidated by you, just because you managed to squeak through alive so far. and asking if you can request special training from Magina Perrin herself. Ballsy, but nobody believes you'll actually do it. You nearly pissed yourself just asking.
Tidus fought down the wave of anger that Zion always elicited in him. Rising to the bait would be a mistake, a waste of time and energy, and Tidus had already made enough of those. It took everything he had to keep composure and simply raise an eyebrow at the other student. "I wasn't trying to intimidate you," he said.
"Oh, please. Why else would you even ask? Trying to psych out the competition, obviously." Zion scoffed. "You've got no poker face, Antirrhinum. So much for that politician's upbringing."
"You think you've got things so figured out," Tidus said. He caught a twitch of Zion's lip out of the corner of his eye. Good. He was getting to them. It was about time. Zion wanted to make Tidus squirm, and he wasn't going to give them that chance. But really, I wasn't trying to intimidate you. I barely think about you at all, actually. No poker face. The Astron would find out about that. Tidus could lie when he needed to. Except for when it really counts, a sinister part of Tidus whispered, and he pushed the thought away. That was in the past. He had learned from his mistakes. He wouldn't make those same errors again. That was the least he owed to Kiun. "I do find it interesting that you find the idea of Madame Perrin as a teacher so absurd," Tidus said, letting his tone wax thoughtful, even as he kept an eye on Zion. "I mean, she's been one of our instructors until now, and she's the rank 2 Omni Tempore, the second most powerful timecaster in the entire universe. What better opportunity could we ask for than personal instruction from someone like that?" He turned to face Zion and grinned at them. He tried to channel the predatory confidence that Dasha and Helix were so good at, but wasn't sure it worked as well with human teeth. He had no pointed canines to give him an edge. Instead, he just poured all of his energy into the thought of towering over Zion. They took a satisfying step back. "You think I won't do it?" Tidus asked. "Are you willing to stake your life on that?" Zion sputtered and struggled to keep their face impassive and aloof. Fear had appeared through the cracks. Good. Chapter 34. A new nightmare had settled into Tidus' mind, flaring to life when he slept, only this one was different. He wasn't reliving one of his deaths. He wasn't seeing the shape-changer. No. This one was much worse. Tidus was standing in Kiun's chambers at the university, a thick, clear barrier cutting him off from his brother. Kiun sat at the desk, thin shoulders hunched, as he wrote and rewrote his suicide note. Tidus pounded his fists against the barrier, screaming at Kiun. Cracks appeared, but not on the barrier. Instead, it was Tidus' own arms that started to splinter. His words never even reached his own ears. His throat ached, and his lungs gave out, and the only sound was the deafening scratch of the pen as Kiun finished writing. Kiun sealed the note, then picked up the shiny syringe from the table. He turned and locked his gaze with Tidus, and didn't even flinch as he injected the blue liquid into his own arm. His red eyes burned into Tidus, unforgiving, scathing, condemning. His mouth twisted in a sneer. "This is your fault," he said, then collapsed to the ground, dead. Tidus screamed, and the barrier disappeared. He ran forward and gathered Kiun in his arms. He tried to pull at the tendrils of time, to bring Kiun back, to undo his death, but the power of time wrapped around Kiun like a cocoon, and his brother dissolved into sand in his grasp. Tidus screamed, and then he was standing, standing next to Kiyun, who stood alive, staring at him. There was something in Tidus' hands. He looked down and saw the syringe, his own fingers pushing the blue liquid into his brother's arms. "No!" Tidus yelled and tried to pull away. His hands wouldn't move. He looked up at Kiyun, desperate, pleading. "I'm sorry. I didn't want this. I don't know how to stop. I'm sorry, please." Kiyun shook his head, his body going limp as the syringe emptied. He fell to the ground. 2 words escaped his lips as the last breath left him. "Thank you." Tidus woke up screaming. He rolled out of bed and stumbled his way into a cold shower. His entire body felt sick, infected, diseased. He struggled to breathe, like the walls were closing in around him, sucking all the air out until he was trapped in a vacuum. Everything around him blurred, colors bleeding together into an incomprehensible mess. Tidus pushed through it, like wading through a fog of paint, until the clouds parted and he blinked up at the sky. He was standing in the cathedral gardens. Luckily, it seemed his autopilot had elected to put clothes on before taking him outdoors. Tidus breathed deeply, letting the sweet scents of the garden wash through him. He spread out his time sense and wrapped it around himself like a security blanket, gently pushing and pulling at the time around him. He had been trying to replicate what Dasha and Mored could do, making themselves imperceptible to time sense. It was the only way to get any real privacy in the cathedral. He was interrupted by the approach of an annoyingly familiar presence, and Tidus opened his eyes in a scowl.
"You scream impressively loudly, Antirrhinum,"
Zion said, sauntering up to him with a self-satisfied smirk.
"Not hard to guess why, honestly."
Tidus tensed, gripping his dagger tightly in one hand. Did Zion know? Did they actually keep track of his family in order to taunt him with it? How deranged were they?
"The 4th trial does have an 87% mortality rate, after all,"
Zion continued. Tidus rolled his eyes. Never mind. Zion had no idea what was really going on. They just thought Tidus was a coward.
"Oh, going to play it cool. Act as though everyone in our dorms couldn't hear you,"
Zion needled. Tidus clenched his jaw. He wanted to not care what Zion had to say, not about anything. But had the whole dorm really been able to hear him screaming? He thought back to his first weeks in the cathedral. He had woken up screaming regularly back then. Had any of the others? He couldn't remember hearing them, but he had had so much else on his mind that didn't mean anything. The thrum of power from the conduit circle around his neck drew his attention. Oh, maybe that was why everyone could hear him. He had accidentally placed a time freeze over the dorms once. Was he projecting his screams into their minds? Tidus swallowed the mess of anxiety trying to climb up his throat and shot Zion a glare. "If you really want to know, I had this horrible nightmare," Tidus said, "that you managed to pass all the trials, and I had to deal with you forever."
"Oh, haha, you're so witty," Zion sniffed. "I am going to enjoy watching a void shifter disembowel you when they finally let you into that arena."
"And I will enjoy when the day comes that I never have to hear your stupid voice again," Tidus returned with a sigh. "You don't even have to be dead for that, you know. You could just stop talking to me." Tidus stood and left before Zion had a chance to respond. The refuge of the garden had been completely ruined by their arrival anyway. There was no point in staying. All it did was bring back the memory of his nightmare and drive a new blade into the weeping wound of Kiyun's death. He didn't need someone bringing it up, no matter how indirectly. He didn't want to talk about it. He didn't even want to think about it. Tomorrow he had his first lesson with Magina Perrin, and he really didn't want to think about that either. Not with how likely it was he would die in the process. He needed something else to focus on. He needed a distraction, something that wouldn't make him think about Kiun, or Ilaria, or anything else that haunted his dreams. A presence caught his attention, flickering in his time sense. Dasha, coming out of her concealment. Tidus altered course, taking the next turn to intercept her path. She sensed him coming and turned to meet him, her tail flicking playfully and golden eyes sparkling.
"Finally reconsidering my offer, I see,"
she said. She wrapped her arms around Tidus' neck and pressed her body against his.
"Trust me, it's so much easier to focus after a little stress relief."
She smelled like charcoal and sugar, with a faint whiff of sulfur underneath. Warmth radiated from her and burrowed under Tidus' skin. Her touch was electric, intense, distracting. Tidus wrapped his arms around her waist, her fingers tangled in his hair. He leaned down and kissed her. She was soft and fierce and everything. He knew she was dangerous. The presence of her dagger sheathed on her shoulder was a reminder he could never ignore. But in this moment, he stopped caring. It was easier that way, to just sink into this moment. There was nothing to prove to Dasha, nothing to overcome, nothing to redeem himself from, because they both knew what this was. It was nothing. It was a distraction, a palate cleanser, something to clear out the debris of the rest of their lives. He could let go for a moment. He could stop thinking, stop remembering, stop strategizing, and just be. He ran a hand over the subtle ridges of her horns, and let the feeling of being with Dasha drown out everything else. It was like he had been stuck outside of his life ever since learning Kiun had died, like he hadn't really existed, and Dasha was pulling him back to reality. Just like leaving the timescape, becoming real again, Tidus let himself drown. Chapter 35. Tidus measured his steps as he made his way to the training room listed on his schedule. Even though he had requested the training with Magina Perrin, his nerves hummed under his skin as the time grew closer. She was the rank 2 Omni Tempore, the second most powerful Timecaster in the universe. She had been only one of the various instructors for years now, and always made every word out of her mouth into some kind of attack. And Tidus had signed up for her undivided attention. After his night with Dasha, everything around him did seem thrown into sharper focus. But instead of helping Tidus concentrate, it left him feeling off balance and dizzy. It had been a mistake. It had felt good in the moment, but only because he was ignoring everything. Ignoring the work he should be doing, the progress he should be making. He couldn't afford to turn off his brain like that. The training room listed was a large one in the East Wing. He knew it had a sparring ring taking up most of it, so it wasn't hard to guess where this lesson would be headed. His footsteps echoed through the halls as he found it, almost a half-hour early just to be safe. Tidus walked in, staring at the tapestries along the walls, woven in bright time-casting mandalas.
"My, aren't you punctual?"
Magina said from the doorway. Tidus spun around. When had she gotten here? He hadn't seen her or sensed her on the way. Tidus bowed towards her. He had to find a way around the concealment the others used to hide from time sense. "I wouldn't want to miss out on any of your valuable training," Tidus said, raising his head to meet her gaze. She grinned like a ravenous wolf.
"Good boy."
She tossed her navy blue braid over her shoulder. It looked solid enough to be its own weapon.
I've seen you progress, Antirrhinum. I know you're a quick study. You can collect and absorb information as effectively as the finest academics. What you lack is the instinct to apply it when you don't have time to think. You need to think as fast as you act.
Tidus nodded, following her across the room to where she picked up some hand wraps and started winding them around her wrists, so he followed suit. The nerves under his skin were pulled taut and ready to snap. He bit down on his lip to ground himself in the moment. He had to focus. He couldn't afford a moment's distraction if he was going to think as fast as he could act, and faster than his opponent could act.
It's good that you don't rely on brute strength to force your way through problems as a default,
Magina said. She had praised him so much already, it only served to make Tidus more nervous. Sure enough, she raised an eyebrow at him, indicating a clear but.
The result is, you haven't fully tested your strength,
Magina stated.
You have no idea how much force you can put behind your punches, so to speak. You've kneecapped yourself by thinking your way around problems, even with that conduit circle carved into your neck. You haven't begun to test the waters. Today, we will change that.
The words from her speech before came back to Tidus, from when Helix had asked about killing them.
Not permanently.
Tidus had noted the look in her eyes at that moment. He was certain she intended for him to die at least once during this first training session alone, that she looked forward to it. Tidus chewed his lip, then reached out into the flow of time and found his anchor, his reset point. It would automatically tether itself to whenever he had last woken from sleep, unless he intentionally affixed it somewhere else. He could put the anchor wherever he wanted if he put in the effort. Tidus slid the point forward until it anchored him to this moment, or well, about 2 minutes before now, after he joined Magina for their lesson, but before they had stepped into the center of the floor. Magina lunged at him without warning, a ripple rushing out through the time particles so strong Tidus could feel it. He pulled up foresight and dodged her first attack. His mind raced alongside his heart, hammering wildly. She had a point to this, right? What was it she had said? He was supposed to test his strength, figure out how much power he could put behind his punches. That had sounded like a turn of phrase, but maybe she had meant it more literally. Magina's voice whipped into his ear, her hands grabbing the sides of his head.
This isn't study hour, Antirrhinum.
Her hands snapped his head to the side, and pain shot from his neck out to the tips of his fingers and toes like a lightning strike. Then all sensation stopped. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. He couldn't even feel the sensation of his clothes on his skin. Darkness swooped in from the edges of his vision, and everything vanished. Tidus woke with a gasp and sat up, buried up to his waist in the sandy particles of time. His neck ached, pulsing waves of pain down his spine and into his skull.
Ugh.
Tidus groaned and pulled himself out from the time sand. "Hey, kid." A familiar voice greeted him, and a shadow fell over him. How did he cast shadows here if there was no sun or concentrated light source? Tidus shook his head and got to his feet.
"It's been a spare minute, huh?"
Not Tidus smiled and crossed his arms.
"Sure has,"
Tidus agreed. It had been a while since he had died after all, more than an entire year now. He rolled his neck like trying to work out a pinched nerve from sleeping wrong. It didn't work. Death pains lingered horribly no matter what. What in the void is that? Not Tidus grabbed the front of his robe and yanked him forward. Tidus was surprised to realize how close they were in height now. His future self had towered over him so much the first time they had met. He had always imagined himself child-sized next to him. Now they were almost eye to eye. Except they weren't looking eye to eye. Not Tidus was inspecting the marks around Tidus' neck with a furrowed brow. Those scars sure did attract a lot of attention. "A conduit circle," Tidus said, pushing himself away. "I was trying to break the seal during the third trial." "Damn." Not Tidus shook his head. "You did that with the dagger?" Tidus nodded. "Wish I'd done that. I made a dye from some berries on the planet. Had no effect at all." "Well, it should be giving me an advantage now, or would be if I knew how to use it," Tidus said. "Oh, how'd you die this time anyway?" Not Tidus asked. "Training with Magina Perrin?" Tidus said. Not Tidus raised his eyebrows. "I requested it. She wants me to test my strength. Apparently I've been too smart to put strength behind my punches or something." Not Tidus nodded and frowned in thought, pacing in front of him. "Okay. You'd better have something figured out before you go back and reset it then, huh?" "Yeah," Tidus agreed, then bit his lip. "Actually, before that, there's something. Can I ask you?" "Anything," Not Tidus said. "I mean, I'll try to answer whatever it is." "Kyun, did you... Tidus choked on the words and looked away. "Could I have saved him? Did you?" "Oh." Not Tidus shoved his hands into the deep pockets of his Omni Tempore robes. "Why don't you tell me what happened?" "What?" "Our lives are different, kid," Not Tidus said. "My Kyun, well, he's alive at least." All the air was sucked out of Tidus' lungs, and he sank to his knees. This other version of himself still had Kyun. His family was alive. Tidus was just a broken version of this other self. "It's my fault," Tidus whispered. "No," Not Tidus said firmly. "My Kyun is alive, but it's complicated. Whatever happened to yours, it's not your fault. The Empire has a talent for tearing people apart." "Stop." Tidus shook his head. He couldn't bring himself to explain. The words wouldn't come out. The Empire hadn't torn them apart. Tidus had destroyed Kyun long before he had to cut off communication with his family. It was his own failure and his own blindness that had driven Kyun to his death. Tidus' knees sank deeper into the time sand. It is better to die once. That was a blessing the citizens of the Empire deserved. They weren't supposed to have to grapple with death the way Timecasters did. It was their job to protect the Empire at large from such pain. And Tidus had put that burden onto Kyun and Ilaria. He had let them down and cost Kyun everything. "Hey, kid, Tidus." Firm hands pulled Tidus out of the sand and placed him back on his feet. "Remember what I told you when we first met?" Not Tidus met his gaze. "Being a Timecaster comes with a lot of power, a lot of possibility. But we still have to live with consequences. We can never fix everything or keep everyone safe, no matter how hard we try. We would only destroy ourselves and reality in the attempt. All we can control, really, is who we decide to be." "What does that even mean?" Tidus' voice was hoarse and sticky from the tears burning in his throat. "Even though Kyun is gone, you still have more to fight for," Not Tidus said. "And you are strong, Tidus, and powerful. I can see it. You can take your fate into your own hands. You don't have to be anybody's puppet." Tidus pushed Not Tidus' hands away, wiping the tears out of his eyes. He did still have something to fight for. Even if he would never see her again, Ilaria was alive. She still believed in him, and the assassin that had worn her face was still out there. Not strong enough, not yet. Tidus disagreed. Not until I learn how to use the power I've got. Magina is right. I need that strength. He looked up at not Tidus, desperate for some kind of answer. My conduit circle didn't work, remember? Not Tidus said. But that said, I might have a few ideas. I had a similar hang-up. But you're probably going to like my advice just as much as I did when I pried it out of Helix. A sharp pang stabbed through Tidus at hearing Helix's name in not Tidus' mouth. He gritted his teeth and pushed past it. Might as well try it. He would take any help he could get, and he had to make use of this training with Magina. He knew he was good, compared to the other trainees anyway, and the conduit circle impressed people, but if he couldn't use it, it was worthless. Just another trick to make people think he was better than he really was. Just another gift he was wasting. Okay, well, the answer is, you've got to stop thinking, not Tidus said. I know that's not easy. We're thinkers. But you already know everything you need. You don't have to think it ahead of time anymore. If you want to move all that to instinct, you've got to give your instincts a chance to take over. Stop trying to have a plan. That sounds suicidal, Tidus said. He already regretted the last time he had stopped thinking. That's what I said too, not Tidus confessed, but Helix swears by it, or at least mine does. You should ask yours. He's not mine, Tidus retorted, more sharply and bitterly than he'd intended. Not Tidus shot him a concerned look. I feel like we should talk about that, he said. What happened between you two? Nothing. It's not. Tidus struggled to find the words. I don't need him. I can make it on my own. Huh. Not Tidus said, crossing his arms. I'm sure you can. I'll just ask you one question. Tidus rolled his eyes. Will it be worth it on your own? Tidus scowled. There it was again, the question of making it worth it, proving his life had meaning. He didn't need Helix to validate his existence. He didn't need anyone for that. Wasn't that the whole point? I'll have to decide that for myself, won't I? Tidus turned on his heel and started to walk, focusing on finding the water, the not sea of time. He didn't want to hang around and get lectured by a version of himself that had some different version of Helix to compare to. They weren't the same. There was no point in staying here for that kind of ridiculous thought experiment. That's all it was, not applicable to his life, and he needed to get back to his training. He was supposed to be learning to let his instincts take over, to stop always trying to have a plan. This seemed like the perfect not time to start.